In the summer of 1944, as American Marines clawed across the volcanic sands of Saipan, a message reached Tokyo that froze the Imperial Navy in place. For the first time in the entire war, U.S. bombers could now strike the Japanese homeland directly, and the admirals knew it. Inside dim war rooms, Japan's most senior commanders confronted a terrifying truth. The Marianas had not just fallen, Japan's fate had been sealed. What they said in those moments would echo through the empire, not as orders, but as the quiet realization that the Pacific War had entered its deadliest chapter. In the opening months of 1944, the Pacific War entered a phase that neither Tokyo nor Washington could ignore. Japan had already lost Guadalcanal after a grueling 6-month struggle. The Solomon Islands campaign had carved through what once seemed an unbreakable line. Parts of New Guinea had slipped away under relentless Allied pressure. And yet, despite these mounting defeats, Japan's high command remained convinced that the heart of its empire, the Central Pacific, stood firm. To Admirals Mainichi Koga, and after his death Somu Toyoda, the Marianas were more than distant volcanic islands scattered across turquoise seas. They were the pillars of an iron wall, a final protective barrier shielding the home islands. Tokyo sat 1,500 miles to the west, far enough to feel safe, yet close enough that these islands were considered part of the inner defense ring, a region whose loss was simply unthinkable. This defensive shield stretched across the map like a chain of stepping stones: the fortified air and naval base at Truk in the Carolines, the scattered but entrenched positions in the Marshalls, and finally, the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. Each was garrisoned, armed, and reinforced with the belief that even the most determined American offensive would shatter against them. But while Tokyo clung to this vision of permanence, the United States was preparing something different, something larger, faster, and more coordinated than anything Japan had yet faced. Under Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the U.S. Navy advanced methodically through the Central Pacific, guided by the twin engines of carrier aviation and amphibious warfare. Fast carrier task forces swept ahead like steel storms, neutralizing airfields and sinking supply convoys. Behind them came the landing forces, hardened by earlier campaigns and backed by an industrial output Japan could no longer match. American reconnaissance aircraft flew high above the Marianas, mapping Saipan's steep cliffs, counting trenches, and tracking the anti-aircraft batteries that dotted the island. On the ground, Japanese officers watched these contrails from bunker openings, believing they still held the initiative, yet unaware that U.S. submarines had already severed the vital supply lines feeding their garrisons. Fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements were dwindling to shadows. In Tokyo, Toyoda warned that the fall of the Marianas would tip the entire war into chaos. From these islands, American B-29 bombers could strike the Japanese homeland directly. Losing them would not simply be a setback, it would be the beginning of the end. Now, as spring turned toward the summer of 1944, the ocean stirred with the movement of something colossal. Hundreds of ships, carriers, battleships, transports, and escorts were already cutting westward across the Pacific. The largest invasion fleet Japan had ever imagined was coming for the Marianas. And on the horizon of June 1944, both sides understood. The next battle would decide the fate of the Pacific. June 15, 1944. Before dawn, the Pacific horizon flickered with the glow of engines and signal lamps as one of the greatest armadas ever assembled advanced toward Saipan. More than 500 American ships crowded the sea: carriers, battleships, cruisers, transports, and the countless landing craft that would carry 127,000 Marines and soldiers toward the beaches. For many aboard, the sight was overwhelming, an industrial giant unleashing its full momentum across the ocean. As the first assault waves neared the shoreline, the island remained silent, but the silence did not last. When the ramps dropped and Marines stepped forward, the world seemed to erupt. Japanese artillery, hidden in caves and bunkers dug into Saipan's volcanic ridges, opened fire with a force that witnesses later described as if the whole island exploded at them. Shells tore through landing craft. Machine guns stitched the surf. The black volcanic sand turned into a killing ground within seconds. Inside these defenses, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Sato had already issued his uncompromising directive. There would be no surrender. His garrison of roughly 30,000 troops, supported by well-camouflaged positions and interlocking fields of fire, fought with the grim clarity that this battle would be decisive. Among those trapped on the island was Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the same man who had commanded the carrier strike force at Pearl Harbor. Now cut off and isolated, he witnessed a reversal of fortune so complete it defied imagination. The U.S. Navy bearing down on a Japanese-held island with unstoppable force, while Japan's own fleet struggled hundreds of miles away. News of the American advance reached Tokyo each day, and each report grew more alarming. Initially, the High Command believed the island's defenses would hold, but as U.S. Marines pushed inland, clearing caves, seizing airfields, and anchoring artillery on commanding ridges, the tone shifted. Tokyo began to understand the truth. Saipan was slipping away, and with it, the shield protecting the home islands. Caught in the crossfire were thousands of Japanese civilians, families who had lived on Saipan for years. Their suffering added a haunting dimension to the battle, creating shockwaves in Tokyo. Never before had the homeland civilians been directly exposed to a major American assault. Their deaths, many the result of chaos and terror, broke the illusion that Japan's inner defensive ring was impenetrable. After 24 days of relentless combat, the island fell on July 9, 1944. The consequences were instantaneous and catastrophic for Japan's leadership. The collapse of Saipan triggered a political earthquake. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo's government resigned, unable to justify the disaster. Soon after, a confidential naval report arrived in Tokyo, stripped of optimism and painfully direct. The Marianas have become American air bases. The meaning was unmistakable. From Saipan's airfields, American B-29 bombers would soon be able to strike the Japanese homeland. Panic rippled through the Admiralty. Behind closed doors, they now faced the question they had spent years avoiding and could no longer escape. The moment the report arrived in Tokyo, Admiral Somu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, felt the weight of the empire pressing down on him. The Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam were lost. The islands that had been considered the linchpin of Japan's Central Pacific defenses were now under American control. Inside the shadowed rooms of the Navy General Staff, officers unrolled maps that had once charted the distant reaches of the Pacific with confidence. Now those same maps felt like warnings. Distances that had seemed unassailable were suddenly measured not in months of sailing, but in hours of American B-29 flight time. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Yokohama, all the industrial heart of the empire, lay exposed. Toyoda and his senior admirals faced a stark reality. The combined fleet's air arm had been shattered. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, fought barely a month earlier, had decimated Japan's carrier-based aviation in what U.S. pilots would later call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. More than 300 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed, leaving the fleet almost defenseless against the American juggernaut now advancing across the Pacific. In the cold, silent rooms, the realization sank in. The Empire's strategic advantage had evaporated. Every report that arrived from the front deepened the sense of despair. Japanese intelligence confirmed the Americans were already fortifying Saipan for air operations, preparing to deploy the B-29 superfortress. Toyoda and his officers understood what this meant in visceral terms. The Marianas were not just another set of islands. They were the bridge from which the United States could strike directly at the Japanese home islands. The implications were catastrophic. Every day of delay, every miscalculation, now risked the very survival of the nation. Admirals and staff officers sat in near silence, the only sound the scratching of pens on paper as they tried to reassess a defense that was no longer possible. There was no argument, no debate, only a shared, quiet acknowledgement of defeat. Japan's industrial base, its cities, its population, all that had seemed secure behind the empire's iron wall, was suddenly within reach of American bombs. It was a transformation of the war's reality, sudden and unforgiving. The fall of the Marianas was not merely a tactical setback, it was a psychological rupture. Japan's naval leadership now understood the war had entered a new phase, one where the initiative had passed entirely to the Americans. The next moves would be desperate, calculated, and in many cases futile. Behind the closed doors of the Imperial Navy, the words echoed silently in every mind. If the Marianas are lost, the empire cannot survive. And yet, the full measure of what this meant had yet to unfold. Across the Pacific, the Americans were already preparing an offensive the Japanese admirals feared more than any defeat, the beginning of an aerial onslaught that would bring the war directly to the heart of Japan. By late 1944, the Marianas had been transformed. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, once distant outposts in the Pacific, now bristled with airfields, hangars, and fuel depots. Tinian, in particular, had become a marvel of wartime engineering, the largest air base in the world at that time. Over 200 Boeing B-29 superfortresses, the most advanced bombers ever built, were poised on its runways. Pressurized cabins allowed crews to operate at 30,000 feet, far above the reach of most Japanese fighters, and a payload of 20,000 pounds of bombs meant devastation could be delivered with unprecedented force. With a 3,000-mile operational range, these machines could strike directly at the industrial heart of the Japanese Empire, Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Yokohama, without warning. For the Americans, the logistics had been as remarkable as the aircraft themselves. Thousands of engineers, mechanics, and support personnel worked around the clock, turning volcanic soil into runways capable of supporting these giants. Fuel, bombs, and spare parts were stockpiled with meticulous care. Each bomber represented not just an aircraft, but a tool of strategic precision, designed to bypass the Japanese fleet entirely and project power from the Pacific Islands directly to the Japanese mainland. The first raids began in November 1944. As silver shapes appeared in the early morning sky over Tokyo, sirens blared and civilians scrambled to shelters. Japanese fighter units, trained and seasoned in naval engagements across the Pacific, scrambled in vain. The B-29s cruised high above their reach, precision bombing cities and factories that had seemed untouchable just months before. For the admirals and generals in Tokyo, the psychological impact was immediate and profound. Maps that had once represented control now seemed to mark the empire's vulnerability. Every report from the front underscored a harsh truth: Japan's air defenses were obsolete. The fleet, once the pride of the empire, could not intercept these bombers, and the home islands were exposed in a way they had never been before. Naval officers who had once dominated the Pacific now watched helplessly as a new kind of war unfolded. The B-29s were not ships to be sunk, nor islands to be stormed. They were invisible, distant, and unstoppable from their command posts. Industrial production slowed as factories were destroyed, workers were killed, and transportation networks collapsed. The empire's morale, already battered by losses in the Central Pacific, now faced a daily reminder of vulnerability. The Marianas had become more than just islands. They were the launch pads of inevitability. From these airfields, the United States could strike at the heart of Japan without risking a fleet in battle. And yet, this was only the beginning. Behind the runways, hidden in the hangars and barracks, plans were already forming for a mission so decisive that the entire war could be brought to an end. By mid-1945, the Marianas had become the fulcrum of global power, a pivot from which the Pacific War could be brought to a decisive conclusion. Tinian, once a remote tropical island, had been transformed into a fortress of American air power. Among its endless runways and hangars, A small, highly secretive unit, the 509th Composite Group, trained relentlessly under the cover of absolute secrecy. Every mission, every takeoff, every payload rehearsal was measured in exacting detail. The island, now humming with aircraft, fuel, and ordnance, would soon serve as the launch point for a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen. For Japanese admirals in Tokyo, the summer of 1945 was a time of grim reckoning. Daily intelligence confirmed what had long been feared. The home islands were exposed to relentless B-29 attacks, and Japan's industrial base, already fractured, could not recover. Reports from the combined fleet and the Army General Staff painted an unambiguous picture. There was no fleet left capable of challenging the Americans, no defensive network sufficient to halt the bombing raids. The very cities that had fueled Japan's war machine were now vulnerable, and each new report from the Marianas underscored the inevitability of defeat. Then came August. On the 6th, the Enola Gay lifted from Tinian, carrying the first atomic bomb ever used in warfare, headed for Hiroshima. 3 days later, Boxcar followed, delivering devastation to Nagasaki. The islands that had once symbolized a distant, strategic outpost were now the staging ground for the weapons that would end the war. Tokyo's admirals, who had once commanded vast fleets across the Pacific, confronted an irreversible truth. The fall of the Marianas had made this possible. Without those islands, the B-29s could not have reached the Japanese mainland with such speed, range, and precision. In those final days, the Marianas were no longer just a geographic prize. They were the gateway to the end of an empire. The very infrastructure built to sustain conventional bombing campaigns had been repurposed for a new, unprecedented form of strategic warfare. Tinian's airfields, once designed for conventional bombers, now carried the weight of history itself. For the Japanese leadership, the sight of American aircraft leaving these islands was a silent acknowledgement that the war could not be won. That years of struggle and sacrifice had been rendered moot by geography, engineering, and technological mastery. The legacy of the Marianas extended far beyond the Pacific theater. These islands had not only enabled the final blows against Japan, they reshaped the nature of modern warfare, demonstrating that control of the sky and forward bases could alter the fate of nations. The Marianas had become both a symbol and a tool, the final pivot upon which the course of the 20th century turned. The Marianas Campaign was more than a series of amphibious assaults or naval battles. It was a strategic revolution. For the first time in the Pacific War, long-range air power projected from forward island bases could bypass a fleet entirely, striking directly at the heart of an enemy nation. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam demonstrated the supremacy of carrier-supported amphibious operations, the integration of logistics and engineering, and the decisive impact of air superiority. In military academies decades later, the fall of the Marianas would be studied as a classic example of a decisive strategic fracture, the moment when a nation's defeat became inevitable, not through a single battle, but through a combination of geography, technology, and relentless operational pressure. For the Japanese admirals, the defeat carried an almost unbearable clarity. Their despair was not born of cowardice or incompetence. It was the sober acknowledgement of a threshold crossed. The empire's inner defense line, once considered impregnable, had been breached. The industrial heart of Japan lay within reach of American bombers, its cities vulnerable to devastation, its navy impotent to respond. Every calculation, every contingency plan, every hope for a strategic turnaround had been rendered obsolete in the span of weeks. Yet the lessons of the Marianas extended beyond Japan. The campaign redefined the logic of modern warfare. Islands were no longer just territory, they were launchpads for power projection. Aircraft were no longer merely tactical tools, they were instruments capable of deciding the fate of nations. Forward bases, combined with mobility and firepower, became a principle that would shape military strategy for generations. In those few brutal weeks of fighting, the Pacific War had changed forever. The courage and sacrifice of troops, the precision of planners, the innovation of engineers and aircrews, all coalesced to transform a cluster of remote islands into the fulcrum of global conflict. When the Marianas fell, the Japanese admirals did not just see territory lost. They saw the future laid bare before them. The empire they had served, the fleets they had commanded, the strategies they had devised, all had been rendered irrelevant. The war was no longer a contest, it was a foregone conclusion. In the shadow of those islands, the outcome of the Pacific and the fate of the modern world had already been decided.